2019's Harriet is easily one of the most racist, ignorant pieces of propaganda that I have ever seen. It's gratuitous, disingenuous, mean-spirited, and downright disrespectful to Harriet Tubman's legacy. Not only does this movie demonize the victims of slavery, but it also romanticizes the oppressors. Never in a million freaking years would I have thought that a Harriet Tubman movie would make the slave masters the hero and the villain a black bounty hunter by the name of Bigger Long. And yes, you heard me correctly, the villain of the movie is a black guy by the name of Bigger Long. I'm sorry, but this is some repugnant ass shit. Look, I know this is my first time speaking with you earthlings at home, and I'm doing my best not to use any obscenities, but I have to call a spade with this one. Now, for the people at home who might not be aware of what this movie is about, allow me to give you an abridged version, as I really don't want to waste too much time today talking about the plot of this film, as half of it is made up anyway. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into the film. At the beginning of the movie, Harriet Tubman runs away from Gideon, her master, when he doesn't agree to set her future children free. Shortly after she escapes, Gideon decides to hire a black bounty hunter by the name of Bigger Long in order to track her down. With the help of William Still and Marie, Harriet Tubman decides to go back to her old plantation in order to rescue her remaining family members and a few additional slaves. Eventually, Bigger and Gideon track Harriet down to William's office, where Bigger violently beats Marie to death by punching and kicking her in the face when she refuses to divulge Harriet's whereabouts. Eventually, as time passes, Harriet rescues more slaves and garners the nickname Moses. And again, it doesn't take long before Bigger and Gideon track Harriet down. But this time, when Bigger and Gideon finally corner Harriet on a hill, Gideon, the same man who hired Bigger to capture Harriet, shoots Bigger to death. Gideon then proceeds to tell Harriet that he is in love with her before Harriet escapes and goes free. And yes, my friends, this is the story of Harriet Tubman. No joke. This is the story that Hollywood released to the masses. Where do I even begin? First things first, for those of you who are not aware, there is no historical record of any black bounty hunter who went around catching slaves for white plantation owners, period. I need everyone at home to understand that. In addition to that, there is no historical record of any person by the name of Bigger Long that chased Harriet around while she was freeing slaves. Any person with an IQ of 12 and a general understanding of United States history would know that during the time that Harriet Tubman was freeing slaves from 1849 to 1860, white slave owners had an unparalleled fear of slave uprisings, as they were pretty freaking common. They would never, and I repeat, they would never allow any black person to run around with a gun unchecked and uncontrolled. It just wouldn't happen. And if you think I'm BSing you, allow me to share a few excerpts to prove the validity of my claim. This quote actually comes from Theodore Branter Wilson, The Black Code of the South. It was published in the University of Alabama Press in 1965, and the excerpt is going to come from pages 26 through 30. Begin quote. It is not surprising that the first North American English colonies, then the states of the new republic, remained in dread fear of armed blacks, for slave revolts against slave owners often degenerated into less selective forms of racial warfare. The perception that free blacks were sympathetic to the plight of their enslaved brothers and the dangerous example that a Negro could be free also caused slave states to pass laws designed to disarm all blacks, both slaves and free. So as you can clearly see here, most laws during that time period were designed to disarm all blacks. So let's continue with another excerpt to prove the validity of my claim. In Maryland, these prohibitions went so far as to prohibit free blacks from owning dogs without a license, and authorized any white to kill an unlicensed dog owned by a free black, for the fear that the black would use the dog as a weapon. Mississippi went further and prohibited any ownership of a dog to a black person. So as you can clearly see, black people couldn't even own a dog, let alone a gun. So that means Bigger Long's funky ass would not have been able to do any of the shit that he was doing on film. But I digress. Let me hit you guys with another quote so I can chop this racist film to shreds. So the next excerpt I'm going to be using today comes from Stanley Elkin's article on slavery. It was published in the University of Chicago Press in 1968. The page number is 220. Begin quote. Understandably, restrictions on slave possession of arms go back a very long way. While armed restrictions on free blacks predated, these restrictions increased dramatically after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, a revolt that caused the South to become increasingly irrational in its fears. Begin new quote. Virginia's response to Turner's rebellion prohibited free blacks to keep or carry any firelock of any kind, any military weapon, or any powder or lead. The existing law under which free blacks were occasionally licensed to possess or carry arms was also repealed, making arm possession completely illegal for blacks. Now, before we go any further, let's turn the camera back at me because I want to chop this racist film up. Turn that camera back over to me right now. Now, did you guys hear that last part? Completely illegal for blacks. Completely illegal for blacks. What part of that do you not understand, Hollywood? So once again, Bigger Long could not have existed, as blacks were not allowed to own guns, firearms, dogs, or any type of ammunition. So this begs the question, why was the character Bigger Long made up in the first place? And why was he placed in a Harriet Tubman film? This film was supposed to be the true account of her life, the unspeakable horrors and the obstacles that she had to overcome, i.e. slavery. Do you see how violent Twisted Hollywood is? Instead of telling the truth about what really transpired during slavery, during Harriet Tubman's life, they would have you believe that a black man was the true villain in slavery, not the white man or the white woman, even though we actually have thousands of historical records to substantiate this. And now that I'm on this subject, come to think of it, none of the white plantation owners beat, whipped, or tortured any of their slaves the entire movie. In fact, the only real violence in the film came from the black slave catcher Bigger Long. I kid you not. Instead of using violence in the Harriet film to get what they wanted, the slave masters would frequently converse with their slaves in a soft-spoken, tactful voice like a manager would speak to his employee. Now earlier, when I was giving a brief synopsis as to what transpired in the film, I mentioned that Gideon, Harriet Tubman's master, ultimately saved her from the clutches of Bigger Long. I also mentioned that he had confessed his love to her and set her free at the end of the film. Now I have a serious problem with this narrative for two reasons. For starters, it's a goddamn lie. Two, it takes away from Harriet Tubman's story as she never needed and had a white savior to help her out of slavery. And three, it's completely egregious. Much like Bigger Long, there is no historical record of Harriet Tubman being saved by her racist slave owner, or by any person by the name of Gideon Brodes. And on top of that, does anyone honestly believe that a plantation owner would go out of their way to save their slave, especially during that time period? Now, contrary to what Hollywood would have you believe, no one, and I mean no one on those plantations could afford to lose a slave, especially around the 1800 time period. Now, what history won't tell you is that around the time that Harriet lived, slave breeding farms were in full effect. And for the people at home who don't know what slave breeding farms are, allow me to explain. Like the name suggests, slave breeding farms were a way for slave owners to replenish their Negro workforce due to the abolishment of slavery and the reduction of slaves coming from Africa. At the breeding farms, enslaved African men were forcefully made to sleep with enslaved African women to get them pregnant. On a daily basis, the men were forced to have sex with about 6 to 7 women in a day. The slave owners did not care if the women were the mothers, sisters, or cousins of the men. They just mated them like animals. This was the origin of the word motherfucker. Many of the men died in the breeding farms due to sexual exhaustion. In addition to that, plantation owners also raped their slaves with the sole purpose of getting them pregnant. When this happened, the plantation master would either place his own child in the field to work or sell them in the market. It was as simple as that. And for the people at home who think I'm making all of this up, allow me to read an excerpt from Birthing a Slave, Motherhood and Medicine. As of 1808, when Congress ended the nation's participation in the international slave trade, planters could no longer import additional slaves from Africa or the West Indies. The only practical way of increasing the number of slave laborers was through new births. With so much at stake, black women's reproductive roles became politically as well as economically decisive. If enslaved mothers did not bear sufficient numbers of children to take the place of aged and dying workers, the South could not continue as a slave society. And if that's not enough proof for you, here's another excerpt. Begin quote. As long as slave power continued to grow, breeders could literally bank on future demand and increasing prices. This made slaves not just a commodity, but the closest thing to money white breeders had. By a conservative estimate, in 1860, the total value of American slaves was $4 billion. Far more than the gold and silver circulating nationally. At the time, slaves were worth more than anything slave masters could possibly imagine. And for my viewers at home who want to know just how much slaves were valued in the South during that time period, the number was $4 billion, and that number doesn't even include the crops that were being produced by the slaves for their plantation. If we factor that in, the number would increase to $1.92 billion. And for the sake of conversation, let's look at the North, shall we? In the North, around that time period, the total value of gold and silver in circulation was $228.3 million. So as you can clearly see, there was a huge economic disparity between the North and the South. This is what eventually led to the Emancipation of Proclamation, but that's a video for another time. Now, why is this important and what relevance does this have to the Harriet Tubman film? Well, that's pretty simple. Because Europeans could no longer import slaves from Africa, the only way that slave owners could count on future economic growth, i.e. payment, was if female slaves gave birth to more children. These children were used to replace the older dying slaves, and according to modern academia and the excerpts that I just read above, in the South, you could obtain more money from selling slaves than you could obtain running an entire farm producing and selling crops. And again, it should also be noted that the total number of slaves in the South was valued higher than the total gold and silver in America. Slavery was the most valuable commodity on the continent. This lends credence to what I had originally stated before. No white slave master would allow his or her slave to go free, especially when slavery was so lucrative. It just wouldn't happen. Allowing even a single slave to leave would be equivalent to letting $15,000 of your own money go today, as that's what a slave would be worth in 2019. In addition to that, you have to remember that the average woman who was a slave at that time period was required to give birth to 15 kids before she was even allowed to be free. This would bring the total value to $225,000 in today's money. Now, on top of that, it was stated in Harriet Tubman's very own autobiography that she freed anywhere from 200 to 300 slaves. And for the sake of conversation today, we're going to go with the higher number, 300. That would be equivalent to $4.5 million in today's money. $15,000, which was what each slave was worth, times 300 slaves gives you $4.5 million. So now that we all know this, I want to take the time to ask my viewers at home a serious question. Do you believe for an instant that Harriet Tubman's master, Gideon, who was making $4.5 million from slavery, would save Harriet Tubman and allow her to leave with $4.5 million of his money? Does that even sound logical? The answer is hell no. So once again, I'll reiterate what I already stated before. This movie has got to be one of the most racist pieces of violence that I've seen in quite some time. Hollywood has successfully taken Harriet Tubman's story and flipped the script entirely in order to retell history. They have successfully made the oppressors the heroes and the victims the bad guys. And instead of telling the truth about slavery and revealing what really transpired on those plantations, namely the slave breeding farms that I just mentioned above, or buck breaking, rape, abuse, or any other unspeakable horror that has never been shown on film, Hollywood decided to avoid all of that completely in favor of telling a pack of lies about a black bounty hunter and a white savior that never existed. This is insanity. And at the same time, this is the omnipotent power of Hollywood, the media, and Europeans. And if anyone at home has any doubts about what the hell I'm saying, all one needs to do is look at this movie for proof. This movie has successfully proven that Hollywood, the media, and Europeans have the power to murder you, rape you, steal from you, oppress you, and then rewrite the story with themselves as being the hero. Now, I've said this off camera to S and Rican, and it looks like I'm going to have to say it to all of you at home. This is why knowing history is so important. And this is why black people need the opportunity and the outlets to tell their own story, because apparently these people have no respect, honor, and integrity. And I would even go as far as to say that they are physically incapable of telling the truth. And for the people at home who don't understand how idiotic and damaging this Harriet Tubman movie narrative is, let me give you two real-life examples. Back in November, there was a movie out in theaters called Midway, which was about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Can you imagine if Hollywood wrote the story in a way where instead of the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, a white military pilot went rogue, betrayed his own people, and bombed Pearl Harbor? And at the end of the movie, a Japanese man by the name of Bigger Chan kills him and saves America? Huh? Can you imagine that? How the hell would that sound? Let me give you another example. Can you imagine watching Schindler's List, and instead of making the Nazi SS officer Armand the bad guy in the story, The writers decided to make him the hero who actually helped Schindler save Jewish people from a concentration camp. Now, how would that sound? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that shit? Now, I have a serious question for Hollywood. If no other historical movie paints the victims as the bad guys and the bad guys as the victims, why the hell was this done in Harriet Tubman's first movie? And now that we are on this subject, let me point something else out that really pisses me off. Can you imagine all of the people out there who really don't know Harriet Tubman's story? Can you imagine all of the little kids who are going to see this film and believe that this is what really transpired during slavery? If I didn't know any better, I'd say that this film was created with the sole purpose of rewriting history for a new generation of children. And before anyone states that I'm reaching too far, all one needs to do is look at Cynthia Erivo's Hot 97 interview, where she clearly stated that she wanted kids to go see this film.
I feel like this film is for a 12-year-old.
It's for families. We wanted people to come and see it, because I think there are many films that focus on the brutality of slavery, but it means that your kids can't come with you to see these stories. And the fact is, because it's not taught often, you can bring your 13-year-old, you can bring your 12-year-old to come and see this, and they won't be traumatized by it.
Now, originally I used to have a serious problem with Cynthia Erivo due to her blatant disrespect towards African Americans on Twitter. But after her involvement with this film, I can now say for a certainty, without a shot of a doubt, that I hate her. Look, it's one thing if you want to sell your own people out for money and commit treason by participating in this film, Cynthia, but don't try to indoctrinate children with this racist propaganda. Just don't. You know damn well that this movie isn't historically accurate in the slightest, so why on earth are you advocating for kids to go and see it? I mean, let's be serious here. What do you think kids will learn from watching Bigger Long beat a black woman to death with their bare hands? What do you think kids will learn from admitting slavery from this film? What do you think kids will learn from seeing a white savior in a Harriet Tubman film that never existed? I'm sorry, my bald-headed friend, but slavery was not this PG-13 BS that you're trying to perpetuate. In case you're not aware, slavery was single-handedly the most vicious act in American history, period. And that's an understatement. How fucking dare you try to destroy and alter Harriet Tubman's legacy? How dare you try to alter what really transpired during that time so that way you can sell tickets to children? And again, while I'm on the subject of Cynthia Erivo, it would be remiss of me not to mention something else that she said during her Hot 97 interview. Take a look.
My director is an African-American woman, and we both did the research together.
Pause. What was that, Cynthia? I beg your pardon? I beg your pardon? I beg your pardon? Let me hit the rewind button so y'all can hear that again. Let me hit the rewind button so y'all can hear that again.
My director is an African-American woman, and we both did the research together.
Did you guys just hear what she just said? You did research. You did research. You did research. Now let me stop the interview in order to point something out. Turn the camera back on me, turn the camera back on me so I can go in on this chick. What part of history did you review, Cynthia? What part of history did you research? Because I just proved to everybody at home and to you that this entire film was made up. And in case you forgot what I just mentioned, let's review. Number 1, it was completely illegal for blacks to own guns, Cynthia. Number 2, Bigger Long never existed, Cynthia. Number 3, Gideon never existed, Cynthia. Number 4, no white man ever saved Harriet Tubman, Cynthia. So once again, I'll reiterate. What part of history did you research? Now take a look at the picture on the left of Cynthia Erivo's portrayal of Harriet, and take a look at the real-life Harriet Tubman on the right. As you can clearly see, Cynthia Erivo looks terrified in every single still. Now take a look at the right of the real-life Harriet Tubman. Does she look scared? Does this lady look like she feared anybody? Look at how she clutches her hands together like a boss. Look at that expression on her face. You can tell that she means business. She's in control. She's powerful. She's confident. So once again, Cynthia, how did you look at this picture and equate this picture to that picture? Your performance is completely off. Now, before I went on break, I stated that Cynthia Erivo had no right to push this racist propaganda on children, something that I stand by wholeheartedly. And earlier, I also stated that this movie was made with the sole purpose of altering history for a new generation of children. And before anyone can say that I'm jumping to conclusions, take a look at Exhibit A. Now, as you can all clearly see, this tweet comes from Tay, a young girl who went to go see the Harriet Tubman film. Tay now believes that some black people were just as bad as white people during slavery. Now let's take a look at another tweet. This time, this one comes from Zoe. let's see what good old Zoe had to say about the Harriet Tubman film. This is a shame. This is a darn shame. So once again, I think you guys can all clearly see this movie has successfully done its job. It's successfully done its job. It has brainwashed kids and people alike to believe that black people were actually just as bad as some of the white folks during slavery. It's done its job. It has systematically programmed people into believing that black people were just as bad as Europeans. And this coon Cynthia Erivo has the audacity to say that she wants kids to go and see this? Cynthia, you must be smoking dope. Here's some real advice for you kids at home. Boycott this movie and tell all of your friends to do it as well. Now, at this time, I want to take the opportunity to tie something into the story that you might not be aware of, as most media outlets have done a pretty good job at suppressing this story. And the story I want to talk about today is none other than the long-running feud between Comcast, Charter, and Byron Allen's Entertainment Studio Network, or ESN for short. Now, for the people at home who don't know what's going on between Byron Allen, I'll give you a brief synopsis as to what transpired between the two parties, as the story is pretty long and I really don't want to take up any more of your time today. The story goes that Byron Allen, founder, owner, and chief executive officer of Entertainment Studio Network, sued Comcast and Charter, two of the largest cable providers in the world, because he alleged that they refused to carry ESN's content on their network due to racial discrimination. Now, in response to Allen's accusation, Comcast argued that Allen was not able to prove that racial bias was the major factor in their decision not to carry his networks, and as a result, the case should not be heard in court. Now, contrary to what Comcast believed, Allen filed two separate complaints against Comcast and Charter in district court. Unfortunately, both lawsuits were dismissed, giving Comcast and Charter the edge. However, on an appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court reversed Comcast's decision, allowing Allen to proceed with his initial lawsuit so that way it could go to discovery. And for the people at home who are not privy to all this legal jargon, allow me to explain what discovery means. In law, the discovery phase is the exchange of legal information and known facts in a case. Parties in a case are required to participate in the discovery process. This typically means that both parties must hand over information and evidence about a claim, so that way all participants can know what they are facing in a trial. So what does this mean in layman terms? Well, that's pretty simple. Once Byron Allen's lawsuit commenced, Comcast would have no choice but to hand over all of their emails, contracts, texts, and any other information that was requested by Byron Allen's legal team. And with this information, Allen alleged that he would be able to show without a shadow of a doubt that Comcast had been discriminatory towards him and other black business owners. Now this, my friends, is where things get crazy. Because Allen was now allowed to proceed with his case, Allen decided to use the Civil Rights Act of 1866 for grounds of his lawsuit. And for the people at home who don't know what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is, read a book. Just kidding. Allow me to explain. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was a law that was created in order to protect the newly freed slaves of December 1865. This law, which is now part of 42 U.S.C. Section 1981, prohibits all racial discrimination in all economic transactions. To be more technical, this law simply states that all non-white people will have pathway to fair contracting and fair opportunity to inclusion. It also says that all persons who are non-white will have the same rights to make and enforce contracts. So what does this cover exactly? Well, that's simple. It covers government contracting, contract between two people such as Byron Allen and Comcast, contracts between an employer and an employee, housing contracts, and so much more. Okay, so now that we understand what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is, let's get back to the story. Now, before Byron and his legal team could proceed with the lawsuit and move to the discovery phase, Comcast, who was unhappy with the Ninth Circuit Court's decision, decided to appeal to the Supreme Court. Now, according to eyewitness accounts and Byron Allen himself, who has been pretty vocal about the entire ordeal, the Supreme Court wasted little time when it came to rejecting both his and Comcast's case entirely. The problem is, and I want to reiterate, the problem is, while the Supreme Court didn't want to hear either party's case, they did decide to listen to Comcast's plea for the but-for standard. And here, my friends, is where things get really scary, like terrifyingly scary. For those of you who are not aware, the but-for standard forces any plaintiff who is filing a lawsuit to prove 100% that the reason that they didn't get their dream job, housing loan, or in this case, a deal with Comcast was because the company discriminated against them 100%. So in layman terms, the but-for rule rule states that you have to prove that racism was the sole motivating factor for you not obtaining contractual inclusion. And get this, you are not allowed to go to the discovery phase until you prove this. Now, this begs the question, how on earth is someone supposed to prove that you discriminated against them due to the color of their skin, religion, or sex if you can't go to the discovery phase? This has got to be the most asinine thing I have ever heard in my entire life. Because Comcast doesn't want to be sued for racial discrimination, they are trying to change the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And in its place, they are trying to force this new but-for standard. I'm sorry, but fuck you, Comcast. How dare you try to adjudicate something that was put on the books nearly 150 years ago to protect African Americans from discrimination? If you truly had nothing to hide, then there should be no reason why you wouldn't allow this case to go to the discovery phase. That's like if I had a wife and she suspected me of sending nude photos to another woman, and all she wanted to do in order to clear this up was to check my phone, and instead of allowing her to do that and complying with her demand, I denied her that right completely. Now, I don't know about you at home, but if I was truly innocent, I would have no reservations about her going through my phone so that way I could substantiate my innocence. And for the people at home who don't understand how bad this is, allow me to play a clip from the griot where Byron Allen goes into keen detail as to what's getting ready to transpire if this law goes into effect.
So when I sued them, I said, these numbers don't work. And the Ninth Circuit agreed with me twice. They appealed it, and the Ninth Circuit upheld the decision in our favor twice. And they said, okay, we don't like this decision. We're going to the Supreme Court. And they took it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rejected 99% of the case, the things they wanted them to listen to. The Supreme Court decided not to listen to the merits of my case against Comcast and against Charter. They decided not to listen to it. They said, but we will use this opportunity to look at the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Section 1981, the Supreme Court. Interesting. And in doing so, what they're saying is, Comcast and Charter, we want to use the but-for standard. So for Natasha to use this law that was put on the books 153 years ago to protect her, Natasha cannot use this law, use it, unless Natasha can prove that they discriminated against her. And it was 100% the sole reason, 100%, the sole reason they discriminated against Natasha is because she's black.
There are civil rights activists who say that's going to be nearly impossible of a standard to uphold.
Of course.
Because who explicitly says, you know, rare exception that they're not doing business because you're black?
Well, they could actually say, hey, Natasha, check this out. I'm discriminating against you. 99% of the reason I'm not doing business with you is because you're black. And 1% is because you're wearing tennis shoes.
And that would be okay.
And that's okay. And you cannot use this law that was put on the books to protect you 153 years ago to make sure you had a pathway to economic inclusion. Now, this is coming from the #1 and #2 cable operator in America that pulls billions and billions of dollars out of the African American community in the way of subscriber fees. And that's not okay. So that's the position that they've now gotten this case into. They took it to the Supreme Court, not me.
So as you can all clearly see, if Comcast wins this case, the Supreme Court's decision would now affect anyone and everyone who brings a lawsuit under this civil rights statute. Now, why is this important, and why did I choose to bring this up during my review of Harriet Tubman? Well, that's pretty simple. For starters, I wanted to show just how twisted and messed up Comcast is. And in addition, I wanted to point something out that most people might not be aware of. What if I told you that not only is Comcast challenging the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but they are also the devious culprits who created the Harriet Tubman film? And what if I told you that these devils are profiting off of all of the African Americans who go and see this film? And at the same time, behind closed doors, they're doing everything in their power to destroy African American civil rights. And if anyone at home doesn't believe me, once again, I'll prove the validity of my claim. Now, all I did was type Comcast into Google, okay? And as you can clearly see, Comcast owns NBC Universal, NBC Universal owns Focus Features, and Focus Features created the Harriet Tubman movie that showcased black people in a bad light, i.e. Bigger Long. Now let me turn the camera back to me once again so I can go on in. Do you guys see how foul these dirtbags are? These foul suckers have the audacity to challenge the Civil Rights Act of 1866, something that could destroy the lives of millions of people, by making it almost impossible for any victim of discrimination to seek justice in court. But at the same time, they release a Harriet Tubman film that is supposed to uphold and support civil rights. Is this a joke? Is Comcast sick in the head? This has got to be the biggest oxymoron that I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Now, I've said this once and I'll say it again. Boycott this film and boycott Comcast. And do it now. That's the only solution to this problem. Hit these phallus suckers where it hurts, namely their finances. Stop spending money on their cable services, stop spending money on their films, and stop watching NBC. Kill these dirtbags right where they stand, much like they're trying to kill the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So before I close out, I think there's only one more thing that I need to do that will complete this entire story. I think it's only fair that I hold Cynthia Erivo, Casey Lemons, Deborah Chase, Omar Dorsey, Comcast, and the entire crew who was responsible for the production of this film accountable. And how am I going to hold them accountable, you might ask? Well, that's pretty simple. I'm going to put their ass on the very first Coonameter chart. Now, before I add Cynthia and the gang to this chart, I think it's imperative for me to provide everyone at home with a concrete definition of what cooning is. That way, there won't be any widespread confusion in regards to the terminology. Cooning, or coon, is a person who is fully aware of another individual's racism or discrimination and acts in a manner that contributes to their oppressor's agenda. So in layman terms, a coon is a person who acts treasonous to his or her own people for the benefit of the racist. So now that we got that out of the way, let's rank these people, shall we? Number 1, for being a sellout and being treasonous towards your own people, I'm gonna give Cynthia Erivo, Deborah Chase, and the gang at Comcast 5 shits out of 5 shits, making it the highest possible number I can give them for their coonery. Number 2, for lying, for saying that Bigger Long existed, for saying that you researched this film, for saying that this film was historically accurate when I've already substantiated that it wasn't. I'm gonna give them 5 shits out of 5 shits again for omitting slavery and sacrilege. I'm gonna award them 5 shits out of 5 shits. And with that being said, friends and family, I'm going to end this video there, as this video went on far longer than I anticipated. Join us next time on A Pretty Lie Instead of an Ugly Truth, Episode 0, The Truth About Africa and Egypt.